Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and this is going to be another Q&A where I'm going to answer 10 questions from the post I made on the community page on YouTube. So the first question is, since training for strength requires longer rest periods in between sets, in brackets local, systemic and CNS recovery, sessions can become long in duration. Is there any way to condense the session without sacrificing the quality of work? Good question. And I think yes, there definitely is. So for max strength, obviously we need longer rest periods between sets to make sure we can put maximal intent into each set, especially with compound lifts like squats and deadlifts where there's going to be lots of accessory muscles, there's going to be cardiovascular demands and also CNS fatigue and psychological readiness. So if we do all our working sets with maximal recovery between, then our sessions can become really long. And yes, there is definitely some ways that we can condense our training to make it more time efficient. So the first thing I would look at is when we're doing a session for maximum strength, we don't actually need all our sets to be in that sort of 1 to 3 rep range or 1 to 5 rep range. Generally with max strength training, we want to do maybe 1 to 2 top sets of a heavy working weight, and then the rest of our sets we can do as back off sets where the goal is muscle hypertrophy. I don't see much of a point of doing, 5+ sets in a session of really heavy loads. That doesn't really make that much sense to me. To maximize your neural adaptations, you probably only need to touch those heavy weights for maybe 1 to 3 sets in that session and only do that maybe 1 to 3 times per week. After that, the rest of your working sets can be more hypertrophy oriented where we're actually building the structural adaptations. Then that can transfer when we need to maximize those neural adaptations. So yeah, I think only maybe 1 to 3 top working sets where you have absolutely maximal recovery and you're going for maximal intent with each set. The rest of them can be back off sets where you're using a lighter load. You probably don't need quite as much recovery. And then working sets after that can actually be a different exercise that's going to have less systemic fatigue and less involvement of accessory muscles. For example, if we did a squat workout where our goal is to maximize our 1RM squat, we might do a few sets of heavy loads somewhere in the 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 rep range. Then we may do another 1 to 3 back off sets in the sort of 5 to 10 rep range. And then we might do another accessory exercise like a leg press or a hack squat or a belt squat to get additional volume for the quads. And that way your session isn't going to take an excessive long period of time as long as you're managing how much volume you're doing. So next question is, if someone has many goals related to fitness like training for soccer, calisthenics, hypertrophy, endurance, strength, power, long distance running, sprinting, obstacles, CrossFit, and many others, where should that person start? Is it possible to focus on different goals at the same time? How would it work? Thanks. So yes, it's definitely possible to focus on different goals at the same time. However, what we need to understand is that the more we focus on one goal, the more it takes away from another. So I like to think of this as an analogy where we have a cup or a bucket and we can only fit so much water into that bucket before it overflows and we're actually overtraining and no longer progressing. So the more activities you want to do, the less time and effort you can actually put into that activity before that cup or bucket overflows and it's going to be too much to actually recover from. However, certain qualities have a lot of carryover and a lot of transfer and are really compatible to work together. For example, strength and hypertrophy are highly compatible and probably not going to really take much away from one another. However, if you want to do something like strength and then endurance running, there's probably going to be less crossover between them and there's going to be more of an effect and one is going to take more away from the other. So there's no real particular way to start this. I think it's probably a little bit unrealistic to focus on all those different things. However, the ones that are your main priority at the current moment, you can work towards achieving those things. And if you did want to do all those different things at the same time, you're going to have to find a way to fit them all in and make sure you're not exceeding your total systemic recovery capacity. Next question is, does timing make a difference in nutrition, particularly protein intake? Really good question here. And I think the answer is yes, but not to a significant degree. For example, let's take this to the extreme. If we only ate one meal every 3 days, a huge meal every 3 days, and we had all our protein, all our carbohydrate, all our fat, all our calories in one meal every 3 days, that is probably going to be inferior for hypertrophy or for strength gains. However, if we take it to the other extreme, when let's say we had 6 or 7 meals per day and evenly distributing our protein and our calories and all that, an excessive number of times in the same day, is that really going to make much of a difference compared to if we have maybe 5 or 4 or even 3 meals per day? So there's a big spectrum here. And I think what we're talking about generally with protein timing is in the day, how many meals or how should we actually distribute and when in the day should we distribute our protein intake. So based on the research we have now and my own practical experience, I'd say maybe a minimum of 3 meals per day is probably a good idea, where we fairly evenly distribute our protein throughout those 3 meals. And we probably want to have one of those meals 1 to 2 hours before training and the other one of those meals 1 to 2 hours after training. And that way we're going to make sure we have sufficient amino acids running through the blood pretty much throughout the whole day. Because remember, when we eat a meal, it doesn't just go away straight away. All the nutrients actually stay in our body for a while. So as long as we're getting about 3 or more protein-rich meals per day, we're pretty much going to have a constant supply throughout the entire day. Next question is how to maintain muscle mass if you change your focuses on other sports. Is it enough to train 1 time per week and do maintenance volume on big group of muscles, chest, back, quads? Thanks in advance. I think, yeah, it's definitely possible to do training to maintain your muscle and focus on something else at the same time. However, I don't think you should go into hypertrophy training with the intent to maintain muscle. I think you just find a volume that you can systemically handle on top of the other sports that you're doing, and then see if you can actually get a small amount of muscle growth from that. I think if you aim for maintenance volume, you're going to be at a higher risk of losing muscle. Whereas if you just reduce your volume to something you can recover from and then still do everything right, take each set close to proximity to failure, strict technique, then the chances are you're probably going to get a small hypertrophy stimulus and you can probably continue growing a little bit simultaneously. So yeah, it's definitely possible, but I would maybe reconsider how you phrase that and just really simplify your program, cut the volume, and then see where you go from there. And if you're not recovering from that, you can try and cut your volume again and see how you respond. Next question is, how much training for tendon stiffness is too much? How to know? So we can't really exactly train for tendon stiffness. Tendon stiffness is something that is seen in sort of high-level sprinters and elastic athletes. So when we do things like plyometric sprinting or isometric strength training, we're improving our ability to maintain rigid joints during ground contacts of those activities. However, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily stiffening the tendon fibers themselves. It's more so we're able to hold more stiff joints during those activities through this training that we're doing. So there's not really too much that you can do, and doing a lot of isometric, plyometrics, and sprint training is not going to make you worse in any way, except it could potentially get you injured if you're training beyond your local and systemic recovery capacity. So for example, if you're getting some irritation in your Achilles tendon over time from doing an excessive amount of plyometrics and sprints, then you're probably doing too much. But it's the same as any other training quality. It's just one particular training adaptation that we're after. Next question is how to develop power. This is a very broad question and there is no best way to do it, but some general guidelines for power training are: number 1, use ballistic exercises. So that means exercise that have no deceleration phase. For example, jumps, medicine ball throws, Olympic lifts, bounds, and any sort of exercises like that. If we use traditional strength training for power development, it doesn't work quite as well because ultimately there is a deceleration to that lift. Even if we use bands and chains, there is still a deceleration at the top of the lift. So ballistic exercises, moderate sort of loads, you want to be able to move some loads, but you want to be able to move that quite fast. So for example, squat jumps, you want a fairly light weight that you can actually explosively jump off the ground with and land appropriately. And then those loads can slowly shift over time based on when you want to peak and when you want to focus on more general qualities. So we can use heavier loads with slower movement velocities further from our peak to develop more general force production qualities. And then closer to our peak, you can use lighter loads where we're moving really fast, which is probably going to have more transfer to sport performance. Next question is, why should we have deload week or not have full reset 1 week for muscle hypertrophy without exercise? So I think this is asking, what is the benefit of having a deload versus just having a week off exercise for the goal of hypertrophy? So the main goal with a deload is that we want to maintain our adaptations while reducing fatigue. So we're not really trying to grow during deload weeks. We're just trying to maintain what we have and let our fatigue slowly come down over the week. The reason this is probably superior to having just a week off is that it still keeps us in touch with the exercise and uses 1 week to maintain the muscle mass that we have. If we just take a full week off, we're number 1 going to somewhat go backwards. We're probably not going to lose much muscle in a week anyway, but we're going to go backwards. We're going to stay out of touch with the exercise, which is probably the biggest point. If you go from doing no exercise to then doing a lot of exercise, that is a big risk factor for injury. So it's going to take you maybe 1 or 2 weeks just to acclimate back to that same volume that you were doing. So you're pretty much just wasting a bit of time. Whereas if you take a deload week, you do maybe half to 2/3 of the previous volume you were doing, you're still pretty much acclimated to that. Your joints are still ready for that. So when you go back to normal hypertrophic volumes, it's a pretty smooth transition. You get straight back into it and start growing muscle once again. However, having a week off every maybe 6 months or 1 year or so is probably a fine idea and can be a good reset. But I do think having deloads as a more frequent way to reduce fatigue is going to be a better option than just having a week off. So the next question is quite long, but it's basically saying that this person has all the equipment they have at home, but they don't feel that they get the best results at home compared to doing group classes or training at the gym with other people. So they ask, are there any thoughts on whether feeling completely drained after a group gym workout is actually physically better for you than following a program in your home for the short/long term? So very interesting question, and I think there are two sides to this. There is number one, just the straight programming and physiological side. Then there is number two, the actual psychological and behavioral side. So I think physiologically, it doesn't make a difference where you are. If you're doing the same training, you get the same adaptations. So that's not really an issue. The issue here is more of a behavioral issue or a psychological issue where this person feels like they can work harder and get more out of training with other people compared to training at home, even though the training may be the same. And I think this is a really interesting question because I think most people actually prefer training with other people than training alone. And I think long term, it's difficult for people to stay strict and rigid to a program when they're doing it by themselves. So the more extroverted you are, I think you're probably going to find that you enjoy training with other people more. The more introverted you are, maybe you enjoy training alone more as well. So in terms of this actual specific question, if you're only training, for example, 1 to 3 times per week, you probably want to get the most out of training that you can in each given session because you're not training that frequently. However, if you're training, let's say 6 days a week or even more than that, you probably don't want to go all out and be physically exhausted each session because you might just then breach your systemic recovery capacity. So there's no real right or wrong answer here. But if you feel like you're getting more out of training with other people, then that's probably just a better option for you. As long as you're not breaching that systemic recovery capacity, you're feeling like you're getting good results and it's not mentally burning you out. So definitely in the short term, I think training with other people is probably more, quote unquote, motivating. However, I think long term, whatever you can stick to better is probably going to be the best option. So that we can actually use this to our advantage. For example, if you're some sort of strength athlete, like a power lifter or a weightlifter or a CrossFit athlete or something like that, and you have a hard, important training session that you want to max out on or be really hyped up for, you can probably then seek to train with other people that are going to be competitive and sort of give you that little boost. Whereas if you try and get hyped up and really pumped up every single training session and you're training 6 days a week, you may make worse decisions and just end up burning yourself out. Next question is, what is the secret to perfect focus during training? I don't exactly know what this question's asking particularly, but there is no real secret that I know that's going to help you focus more in training. But I think preparation is probably the best thing that we can do. If you go into each training session with a specific plan, you know what to do, and it's something realistic that you can continue to progress on, then that's probably going to allow you to have the most focus and the most intent during training. Also, not making training too draining, too long, too hard, or just too much total amount of work throughout the week, because that's going to reduce the quality if you're breaching, again, our systemic recovery capacity. So make sure you've got the right dose, you've planned everything out properly, and you know exactly what you're doing so that each training session you can have the most intent, and you're probably getting the most out of doing higher quality work than doing more work that is poorer quality. Next question is, how much training does it take to reach elite level in some common sports like basketball, cricket, football, golf, rugby, tennis, volleyball, etc.? Good question again, and I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I'm not elite at any of those sports. However, I don't think there is a specific amount of training that you need to do to become elite at those sports. I think if we look at elite athletes in those sports, what they've done is they've been consistent for a long period of time. It's not so much every single day they're trying to smash themselves and get the most out of every single day. It's more of a long-term consistency, love the sport that you're doing and just become an expert in that particular sport. And I think the more skill-based a sport is, the more practice it's going to take. Whereas the more physical a sport is, the more sort of genetically oriented people are more likely to be. For example, something like sprinting, endurance running, you sort of need to have that genetic makeup to be successful in that sport. Whereas if it's more like a skill-based sport, you can just practice for a long period of time and always get better at those technical skills. So to answer the question, I don't know exactly how much training it takes or what exactly it takes, but I think if we look at elite athletes, something we can take away from them is just their long-term consistency to that sport. And I think another thing that we see in elite athletes is they don't really question or think too deeply about anything in particular and overwhelm themselves. They sort of just do the sport, listen to the coach, and put in a good effort every single day, and it sort of comes from there. And then doing that consistently, they sort of get to that elite level from there. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.